NBC News is reporting that former Vice President Dick Cheney has died. He served as the 46th Vice President of the United States under President George W. Bush. Before that, he was White House Chief of Staff, a congressman from Wyoming, and Secretary of Defense during Operation Desert Storm in 1991. Cheney had suffered several heart attacks beginning in his late 30s and had underwent a heart transplant in 2012. Again, NBC News reporting that former Vice President Dick Cheney has died at the age of 84. Let's get some new reaction on his passing with Andra Gillespie, professor of political science at Emory University. Andra, thank you for joining us on this topic today. You know, when we think about Dick Cheney's legacy, 84 years, how do you think he'll be remembered?
He'll likely be remembered as one of the most powerful vice presidents in U.S. history. His path to, I guess, the Naval Observatory was a different one. He was actually the chair of the committee that was tasked with trying to find a vice presidential candidate for George W. Bush in 2000. And then he ends up becoming the vice presidential nominee and then vice president. As vice president, he was selected for the ticket in part because he balanced out what was perceived as George W. Bush's inexperience, but he certainly brought his neoconservative values, especially after the 9/11 attacks, to the forefront. And he pushed forward a foreign policy that was interventionist, that was preemptive, and that certainly had America engaged in the world. He will, really be remembered as having a lot more influence over the vice presidency than other vice presidents, and having really set the stage. Even though there are ways that you could argue that Al Gore did this before him, but really setting the stage for the vice president to be an important player in the president's team, and not just the person who is kind of standing and waiting in case something happens to, the commander in chief.
You know, when you talk about just how powerful he was as VP, I've heard some people say it was almost like a chief of staff role, which he actually had during the Ford administration. What do you think made him so influential specifically compared to some of those other VPs? What kind of decisions was he making behind the scenes?
Well, I mean, you look at the war on terror and how it is being laid out. Dick Cheney is the one who was in the room, and he is the one with the experience. Like, he was chosen because George W. Bush didn't have a whole lot of foreign policy experience. There's an age difference between the two gentlemen. And so even though he looked and perhaps seemed and carried himself as being being older than he in fact was relative to George W. Bush, he was seen as being the one who brought gravitas to that ticket when people were not necessarily taking George W. Bush seriously. And when 9/11 happened and we were in a new paradigm in terms of the war on terror, it was his framing and his ideas certainly played a very, very influential role in shaping how the U.S., invaded Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yeah, I think for that reason you could call him a war hawk. Do you still see any elements of his worldview or governing philosophy in today's Republican Party, or has it just moved in kind of a completely different direction when we're talking about foreign policy specifically?
Well, I mean, yeah, we can see that, especially amongst some proponents of America First, there's a strain of isolationism. I mean, we have to look at the engagement that President Trump has had around the world to understand that that is not exactly how we're moving, but we're not moving in terms of sort of the neoconservative turn that was prevalent during the Bush administration. And in fact, if you listen to certain people who are, part of the administration or who are serving in Congress now, they do tend to speak of neoconservatives as one being relics of a bygone era, but they also speak of their policy positions as being, in a critical way. I think one of the lasting legacies of Dick Cheney is not just kind of how he served in the Ford administration or the first Bush administration or the second Bush administration. It's also how he ends his life. And so he will also be remembered as standing alongside his daughter, Liz Cheney, and endorsing Kamala Harris for president in 2024 because of their concerns about the rule of law and their concerns about what power would look like, under a second Trump administration. So he is certainly somebody who, evolved and was pragmatic over time. He's also somebody who stayed pretty true to his principles, even if they weren't necessarily what was the dominant paradigm of the day.
Yeah, I think his quote, to be exact, last year was that Donald Trump can never be trusted with power again, when he was specifically talking about the insurrection. You mentioned he stood behind his daughter, Liz Cheney, a congresswoman at the time, as she took on the president over that insurrection. But then he also stood behind his other daughter, Mary Cheney, who is openly gay, he came out in 2009, declared his support for same-sex marriage at the state level. So that's two examples right there of him kind of breaking with the Republican Party to stand with his family. What do you think that reveals about Dick Cheney, the family man?
Well, I mean, this is a man who cared about his two daughters, who cared about his grandchildren. And, you know, it wasn't a secret, you know, that Mary Cheney was gay. Her partner, now wife, I believe, you know, was at the inauguration when he was sworn in 2001. And so you could see his evolution on this issue was actually born out of his personal experience and wanting to support, you know, both of his children, you know, not just the one who was in the heterosexual marriage.
You know, Andra, Cheney's certainly a polarizing figure, but almost it might have been a little different from the polarization that we're used to today when everyone is just so divided. But he was here serving at a time, again, Ford administration, George W. Bush administration. Was it kind of different then with just how polarizing he was? I mean, how would you put that into context now in the wake of his passing?
You know, I haven't had a chance to look at social media to see how social media is reacting to the death of Dick Cheney. I think it's important to point out that in terms of domestic polarization, this is something that scholars can trace back more than a generation. There are elements of it that are starting in the 1970s. And certainly Dick Cheney was a polarizing figure, in part because he, you know, was very steady in terms of his beliefs, and he was willing to move forward with things even if they garnered controversy. So, you know, in particular during the War on Terror, he was supportive of aggressive interrogation techniques that included waterboarding. There's some people who argue that those are illegal, and he wasn't swayed in that. So there are always going to be people who are going to be critical of some of his foreign policy stances. But there will also be people who will compare him to the Trump administration, and they might actually kind of have a softer view of him because of who they are comparing him to, especially if they're vehemently opposed to what they see happening in the Trump administration. At the end of the day, despite kind of, you know, the departure that he may have arguably taken with respect to torture, he was somebody who had a respect for institutions, a respect for the Constitution, a respect for the rule of law, and that might earn him grudging respect among some people who disagreed with all of his policy stances.
Andra Gillespie, we'll leave it there from Emory University. Thank you so much for taking some time. We just got the news a couple hours ago, and we appreciate you jumping on at the last minute.